There were 7 men on the street that morning. I counted them the way you count things when you already know the number is wrong, slowly, hoping you misremembered. 7. In a street that once had to move around you if you stood still long enough. The war had not yet been declared over. Not officially. But Asunción had already made its own accounting, quietly, the way cities do when the truth arrives before the papers do. I had been walking that street since I was a child. I knew the sound of it, the weight of it in the early hours, the particular noise a city makes when it is full of people who have somewhere to be. That morning, it made no sound at all. Or rather, it made the sound of wind through a space that used to be occupied. I had learned by then to read absence the way a physician reads a wound. Not by what is there, but by the shape of what is missing. I had worked in the military hospitals for 4 years. I had seen the men arrive. I had seen far fewer leave. And I had kept the records, column after column, in a hand that grew steadier the worse the numbers became. Because someone had to, and I was there. And I had learned that steadiness is sometimes the only thing left to offer. The records told one story. The street told another. And standing there that morning, counting 7 men in a space that once held hundreds, I understood that both stories were the same story. Only one of them had not yet been written down. I thought of Andres. Not his face. I had stopped reaching for his face when I needed him, because it had started to slip in ways I could not control. I thought of his hands. The way they moved when he was explaining something he believed in. He believed in many things, at the beginning. I did not finish the thought. I had learnt not to. Instead, I counted the men again. 7. One of them was very old. 2 were boys who had not yet grown into their shoulders. The others, I did not look too closely at the others. There was a time when I would have found that strange. 7 men on a street in the capital of a country. A country that had sent its men to fight 3 nations at once: Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. A country that had believed, or been made to believe, that it could win. That the war would be short. That the men would come back. I had believed it too. For a while. The wind moved through the street. One of the boys said something to the other. I couldn't hear what. They both looked down. I turned and walked back the way I'd come. There was work to do. There was always work to do by then, because there were so few of us left to do it, and the work did not stop simply because the people had. I did not look at the street again. Not that morning. The map was still there when they came to clear the hospital. I had forgotten about it until then, or told myself I had. It had hung on the wall of the eastern corridor for so long that it had become part of the wall, the way things do when no one wants to be the one to take them down. It was December of 1864 when I first understood what that map meant. Not what it showed. I had known the geography since I was a girl. Paraguay. Brazil to the north and east. Argentina to the south and west. Uruguay, small and certain, below. I had traced those borders with my finger as a child, the way children do, without consequence. What I understood in December of 1864 was the arithmetic of it. Francisco Solano Lopez had declared war on Brazil in mid-December. Within weeks, Argentina and Uruguay had joined the alliance against us. 3 nations, 1 border shared with each. And Paraguay, landlocked, smaller than any of them, with an army that Lopez believed was sufficient, Paraguay had decided this was a war it would fight. I was in the hospital when the news came through. Not a patient. I was already working there by then, keeping records, assisting the physicians. Andres had arranged it. He said it suited me, the order of it, the precision. He was right, though I never told him so. The physicians were gathered in the corridor when the announcement reached us. 4 of them. Men who had spent their careers measuring the distance between what the body could endure and what it could not. Men who understood, better than most, what war produced. I watched their faces. They did not speak for a moment. One of them, Dr. Ferreira, the eldest, turned toward the map on the wall. Just turned. Did not point. Did not say anything. Simply looked at it the way you look at something when the looking is the only honest response left. The others followed his gaze. And then, one by one, they looked away. That was all. No words. No argument. Just 4 physicians standing in a corridor, looking at a map, and then choosing not to look at it anymore. I had thought about that moment many times in the years that followed. In the hospitals further north, when the supply carts stopped coming as often as they should. In the field camps, when I began to understand that the records I was keeping would never be complete, not because of carelessness, but because there were not enough of us left to record everything that needed recording. In the silence after certain battles, when the silence said more than any report, I thought about Dr. Ferreira looking at that map. The arithmetic of borders. 3 nations. 1 of us. He had seen it in December of 1864. Before the first soldier left. Before the first casualty list. Before the first of the letters that would stop arriving. He had seen it and said nothing and looked away. I have wondered since whether saying something would have changed anything at all. I have never arrived at an answer that satisfied me. The map stayed on the wall for 6 years. Through everything. No one took it down. No one covered it. When they finally removed it, in the clearing after the wall behind it was a different color. Lighter. The shape of it remained. A pale rectangle where the map had been, edges softened by time. The outline of something that used to tell us where we were. I looked at that rectangle for a long time. Then I went back to work. They left on a Thursday. I remember the day because of the flowers. The women had cut them from their own gardens, jasmines mostly, and some I didn't recognize, pale things that wilted quickly in the heat. They pressed them into the men's hands as they passed. The men took them without breaking stride. Asunción had not seen anything like it. The streets were full in a way that made the city feel larger than it was. People pressed against walls, leaning from windows. Children lifted onto shoulders to see above the crowd. The regimental bands played. Flags moved in the air above the column. Lopez had declared that Paraguay would not be intimidated. That the alliance against us was an insult the nation would answer. And the crowd believed him, or wanted to, which is often the same thing. Andres was somewhere in that column. I had said goodbye to him that morning, at the house, before the march began. I will not describe that. Some things belong only to the people who lived them. What I will say is that he looked well. That he was not afraid, or did not show it, which with Andres came to the same thing. That he told me the war would be decided quickly. That he had heard this from men who knew such things. That I should not worry. I did not tell him what I had seen on the faces of the physicians. The column moved through the city for most of the morning. Unit after unit, infantry, artillery, cavalry, the full weight of what Lopez had assembled over years of preparation. He had built this army carefully. He believed in it the way men believe in things they have made themselves. Paraguay had approximately 60,000 soldiers at the start of the war, against a combined Allied force that would eventually reach 4 times that number. But the crowd did not know the numbers. Or if they knew, they had decided the numbers were not the point. What mattered was the flags, the music, the flowers passing from women's hands to men's. What mattered was the feeling. That particular feeling a city has when it believes it is at the beginning of something. I stood at the edge of the street and watched. I watched the faces of the men as they passed. Most of them were young, younger than I had expected somehow, though I had known they would be. Some were very young. Boys who had not yet had occasion to look serious and were practicing it now, with varying success. I looked for Andres as long as I could. The column was long, and the crowd was thick, and eventually I lost sight of where he might be. I stayed anyway. I don't know why. Perhaps because leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. My son Eduardo was beside me for part of it. He was 16 that year, old enough to watch, young enough that I still had him beside me. He watched the column with an expression I recognized but did not name. I put my hand on his shoulder. He did not pull away, which was not like him. The music eventually stopped. The last units passed. The crowd began to thin. The flowers that had fallen to the ground were already browning at the edges in the afternoon heat. A woman near me was still waving, though there was no one left to wave at. I watched her for a moment. Then I looked away. Eduardo said nothing on the walk home. I said nothing either. We were, both of us, already somewhere else. I just didn't know then how far away that somewhere else would turn out to be. The first wounded arrived in February. I had been expecting them. Everyone had been expecting them. The hospital had spent weeks preparing, organizing the wards, inventorying supplies, training the additional staff that had been recruited when it became clear that what was coming would require more hands than we had. We were ready, or we believed we were. The train arrived before dawn. I was already at the hospital. I had taken to arriving early in those weeks because the work of preparation gave the waiting somewhere to go. I heard the whistle from the eastern ward, then voices in the corridor, then the particular sound of stretchers, a sound I would come to know the way you know the sound of rain, without having to look to understand what it means. There were more of them than we had been told to expect. The official communications had given us a number. The number that arrived was larger. I noted the discrepancy in the intake records and said nothing about it, because Dr. Ferreira was already moving through the corridor with the expression of a man recalculating something he had hoped not to have to recalculate. Most of the wounds were from Mato Grosso, the northern campaign, where Lopez had sent his forces into Brazilian territory in the opening weeks of the war. The campaign had taken ground, initially. That was what the reports said. What the men on the stretchers said when they said anything was different, not in words, but in the way they held themselves. The way men hold themselves when something has happened that the official version has not yet accounted for. I moved through the wards for most of that day, recording, assisting, doing what could be done with what we had. By midday, it was clear that what we had was not enough. Not the supplies, not the space, not the staff. We managed. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. We managed, and we did not speak about what managing had required. There was a soldier, I did not record his name, which I have regretted since. Young, perhaps 20. He had been wounded in the shoulder and had lost considerable blood but was not, the physician said, in immediate danger. He was conscious when I reached him. aware of where he was. He looked at the ceiling for a long time before he spoke. He asked me how many had arrived. I told him I didn't have the final count yet. He nodded, as if that were the answer he'd expected. As if the absence of a number were itself a kind of number. He said, and I wrote this down later because it stayed with me, he said that where they had come from, there had been no way to bring everyone. That choices had been made. That he did not think the choices were wrong, given what was available. But that he wanted someone to know that choices had been made. I told him I understood. I wrote it in the margin of the intake record that evening. Not in the official column. There was no column for what he had said. In the margin. Small. In case someone read it later who needed to know. That night, I wrote to Andres. I did not tell him about the train, or the number, or the soldier. I told him that the jasmine in the garden had come back early this year. That Eduardo had been helping me in the evenings. That I was well, and that I hoped he was well, and that I was keeping the records carefully. I sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post. Then I went back to the intake records and finished the count. If this story is settled somewhere unexpected, a like is the quietest way to say so. Andres wrote about the river once. Only once. In a letter that arrived in July of 1865, 3 weeks after the battle, because that was how long it took for letters to find their way back to Asunción by then. 3 weeks, sometimes 4, sometimes not at all. He did not describe what happened. Andres was not a man who described things he did not have words for. He preferred silence to approximation, always had. What he wrote was this: that the Parana was wider than he had remembered, that the current was strong in the middle, that the light on the water in the early morning was something he had not expected. That was all he said about the river. I read it many times. Not because the words were unclear, they were perfectly clear, but because I had learned by then to read what surrounded the words, the spaces in a letter, the things a man chooses to notice when he cannot say what he has seen. The Battle of Riachuelo had taken place on the 11th of June, 1865. The Paraguayan fleet, what Lopez had assembled over years, the gunboats and steamers he believed could hold the river, met the Brazilian Imperial Navy in the waters of the Paraná. The engagement lasted most of the day. By the time it ended, the Paraguayan fleet had been effectively destroyed. Ships sunk or captured. Men dead in numbers that the official communications did not specify. What Riachuelo meant, what any military man understood it to mean, was that Paraguay had lost control of the rivers. And Paraguay was a landlocked country. The rivers were not a strategic advantage. They were the only way in or out. Without the rivers, there would be no resupply. No reinforcement from outside. No way to move men or materials that the Allies could not intercept or prevent. The country had become, in the space of one afternoon on the Paraná, an island. I knew this before Andres's letter arrived. Dr. Ferreira had explained it to me, not because it was my place to know such things, but because by then I was the one maintaining the hospital's supply records, and he wanted me to understand what the next months would look like. He was precise about it. The way he was precise about wounds, not to frighten, but because imprecision, in his view, was its own kind of cruelty. So when Andres's letter arrived, and I read his 3 sentences about the river, the width of it, the current, the light in the morning, I understood what he was not saying. He was not saying, we lost the fleet. He was not saying, the river belongs to them now. He was not saying, I don't know how this ends. He was saying, I stood at the edge of the piranha, and I looked at the water, and I thought of something other than the war for a moment. And I wanted you to have that moment too. I folded the letter the way I folded all of them. Carefully. Along the original creases, so the paper would not weaken where it had already been held. I put it with the others in the box beneath the bed. He wrote again in August. And in September. The letters were shorter each time. Not because he had less to say, I think, but because the distance between what was happening and what could be written was growing in one direction only. He did not mention the river again. Not in any of the letters that followed. Not once. I noticed. I did not write to ask him about it. Some silences you leave alone, not because you don't understand them, but because you do. He was brought in on a stretcher in October of 1865. I did not know who he was at first. The intake staff had noted his rank, general, and his wound, which was severe enough that Dr. Ferreira had been called from the other ward immediately. Beyond that, the usual information. Name. Unit. Where he had been found. He was older than most of the men we received. 60 perhaps. The kind of age that looks different on a man who has spent his life outdoors. His face was the color of old leather. His hands, when I took his pulse, were very still. The stillness of a man who has learned to conserve what he has left. The wound was in his side. A fragment, from what? The physicians were not certain. Deep enough to be serious. Not deep enough, initially, to be conclusive. There was a period of several days in which it was not clear which direction he would go. He was conscious for most of it. That was the difficult part. Not for him, I think, but for those of us who worked in that ward. A man who is unconscious requires your hands. A man who is conscious and watchful and says very little requires something harder to give. I attended to him 3 times a day. He watched me work without comment. On the 4th day, he asked me how long I had been at the hospital. I told him, since before the war. He nodded as if this explained something. On the 6th day, he asked me what the intake numbers looked like. I told him I wasn't certain, I should say. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that he had spent 40 years in the Paraguayan army, and that there was very little I could tell him that he had not already calculated for himself, and that he was asking because he wanted to know if his calculation was correct. I told him the numbers. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I had finished my work and was preparing to move to the next bed. Then he spoke. He said that the invasion of Argentina had failed. I knew this. It had become clear by then that Lopez's attempt to move through Argentine territory to reach southern Brazil had stalled, that the forces sent into Corrientes had been pushed back, that the strategic gamble of opening a third front had not produced what Lopez had intended. The general did not tell me this as news. He told me as context. What he said next was the part I have thought about since. He said that he had served under 3 commanders in his career, that he had seen men make decisions from strength and men make decisions from fear, and that the two looked similar from a distance but produced very different kinds of war. That a war fought from strength had a shape to it, a logic you could follow, even when it went badly. That a war fought from fear had no shape, only momentum. He stopped there. I waited. He did not continue. On the 9th day, his condition changed. Dr. Ferreira was with him at the end. I was in the adjacent ward, but I heard, not words, just the particular quality of silence that follows certain kinds of endings. I finished what I was doing. Then I went to record it in the ledger. Name. Rank. Date. The column for cause of death, which I filled in with the physician's notation. The column for next of kin, which I left blank because no one had come and no information had been provided. I did not write down what he had said to me on the 6th day. There was no column for it, and I was not certain then that I understood it fully enough to commit it to a record. I understand it now. A war fought from fear has no shape, only momentum. Lopez would continue for 4 more years after that October. 4 more years of momentum after the shape had gone. And the men would go with it, because that is what momentum requires. It requires the thing in front of it. It does not ask whether the thing in front of it can afford to be spent. I closed the ledger. There were other beds to attend to. There were always other beds. I heard chewy tea before I understood what I was hearing. It was the 24th of May, 1866. A Thursday, I remember, because Thursdays were when I reconciled the supply ledgers, and I had been at my desk since early morning, working through the previous week's entries with the particular concentration that arithmetic requires. The kind of concentration that makes you deaf to everything else until something breaks through it. What broke through it was a sound I had no name for. Not an explosion, or not only that. Something lower. Something that arrived not through the ears, but through the floor, through the desk, through the chair beneath me. A vibration that the body registers before the mind does, the way animals register weather. I set down my pen. The sound continued. Not constant, in waves almost. A long roll, then a pause, then another. From the south. Far enough away to be felt rather than heard precisely, close enough that there was no question about what direction it was coming from. I went to the window. The street below was quiet. The ordinary quiet of a Thursday morning. People moving with the particular purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be. Then I noticed the children. There were 3 of them, boys perhaps 8 or 9, who had been playing in the street when I had arrived that morning. One of them had a hoop. They had been running it along the edge of the gutter, taking turns, making the particular noise that children make when a game is going well. They had stopped. All 3 of them were standing still, facing south. The hoop had fallen against the wall. None of them moved to retrieve it. They stood the way animals stand when they sense something approaching, not frightened exactly. Alert in a way that precedes fear. I watched them for a moment. Then I went back to my desk. I did not pick up my pen. I sat with my hands flat on the ledger and listened to the sound moving through the floor. What was happening, I would learn later, was this. Lopez had ordered a full assault on the Allied encampment at Chihuahua. 23,000 Paraguayan soldiers moving in 4 columns against a fortified position. It was the largest land engagement South America had seen, larger than anything in the wars of independence, larger than anything most of the men involved had been trained to imagine. Lopez believed, or his commanders had persuaded him to believe, that a concentrated assault could break the Allied lines before they consolidated further south. The assault lasted approximately 4 hours. The Allied position held. When it was over, the Paraguayan forces had lost somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men, killed, wounded or captured, in 4 hours, against a force that had prepared its defenses and waited. The Allied casualties were a fraction of that number. I did not know these figures on the Thursday. I knew only the sound, the waves of it, moving through the floor of the hospital, through my hands on the ledger. I knew it went on for a long time, longer than I would have thought anything could go on. And then it stopped. The silence after was different from ordinary silence. fuller somehow. The way a room feels after a large piece of furniture has been removed, not empty, but altered. The air rearranged around an absence. I looked out the window again. The boys were still there, still facing south. The hoop still against the wall where it had fallen. After a while, one of them picked it up. He held it for a moment without doing anything with it. Then he set it back against the wall. They did not play again that morning. Andres's next letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was shorter than the ones before. He wrote about the weather, that the southern winter was coming early, that the nights were cold in ways he had not expected. He wrote that he was well, and that I should not worry, and that he hoped Eduardo was keeping up with his studies. He did not mention Chiuti. He did not mention numbers. He did not mention the assault or the hours or what 4 hours could cost when the arithmetic was wrong. He wrote about the cold. And I read about the cold, and I understood, and I folded the letter along its creases and put it in the box with the others. The box was getting heavier, not from the letters, from what the letters did not contain. I noticed the empty bed on a Wednesday morning, not because it was unusual to have an empty bed. By then the wards moved quickly, men arriving and leaving, or not leaving in a rhythm. I had learned not to track too closely. I noticed it because of which bed it was. 3rd row, 2nd from the window. The one where Captain Villalba had been since the previous Thursday. He had been admitted with a fever, not a wound, which was becoming more common by then. Disease was doing what the battles had not yet finished. Villalba was not gravely ill when he arrived. Weakened, but coherent. He had asked me, on the first day, whether I had news from the southern front. I told him only what the official communications had said. He had smiled at that, not unkindly, as if the gap between official communications and news was something he found mildly amusing. He was a friend of Andres. That was how I knew him. Not well, but enough. They had served together in the early months, before Andres had been moved further south. Villalba had been rotated back to Asunción for reasons that were not explained to me, and I had not asked, because by then I had learnt that the reasons for things were rarely as useful as the things themselves. We had spoken several times during his stay. Carefully, the way you speak with someone who knows someone you love, when you are not certain what they know, and they are not certain what to tell you. He asked after Eduardo once. I told him Eduardo was well. He nodded and looked at the ceiling and said that was good. That it was good the boy was still in Asunción. I had not asked him what he meant by that. I had wanted to. But there are questions you don't ask when you are not prepared for the answer, and I was not prepared that week for whatever Villalba might have said about Eduardo and the front and what the front was becoming. So instead, I had asked about his fever, about his appetite, about whether he needed anything from the dispensary. The questions of a woman doing her work, which I was, and which was, by then, also a way of not doing other things. On the Tuesday evening, his fever had broken. I noted it in the record. Dr. Ferreira had said he was improving, that another week of rest would see him well enough to be discharged. On Wednesday morning, the bed was empty. Not discharged. I checked the ledger immediately. No discharge notation. No transfer. The column where the reason for departure should have been was blank, which was not permitted under the recording system I had spent 2 years maintaining. Blank columns meant paperwork. Blank columns meant someone had to account for the gap. I went to Dr. Ferreira. He listened to me describe the discrepancy. He did not look at me while I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, And then he said that Captain Villalba had been collected during the night, that I should mark the departure time as 2 in the morning, and leave the reason column as, he paused, as administrative transfer. I asked him what that meant. He picked up the papers he had been holding and said that it meant what it said, and that I should update the ledger before the morning rounds. I went back to my desk. I sat for a moment before I opened the ledger. Not long. Long enough. Lopez had been executing officers since the middle of 1866. I knew this not from official communications, but from the particular silences that had begun to appear in the hospital, the careful way certain names were not mentioned, the way men who had been talkative became quiet when the conversation moved towards certain subjects. Suspicion of treason, real or constructed. By then the distinction had become difficult to maintain, and I was not certain Lopez was interested in maintaining it. I did not know if Villalba had been executed. I did not know what he had said, or been accused of saying, or been reported to have said by someone who needed to report something. I knew only the empty bed and the blank column, and Dr. Ferreira's careful instruction about what to write in it. I wrote administrative transfer. 2 in the morning. I closed the ledger. Then I thought about the last thing Villalba had said to me, that it was good Eduardo was still in Asunción. The particular weight he had put on the word still. I had not asked him what he meant. I understood now that I would not get the chance. The first time I saw a child in uniform, I thought I had misread the situation. It was late in 1867. The hospital had been receiving transfers from the southern camps with increasing frequency. Men who could not be treated adequately in the field. Men for whom the field had run out of what was needed to treat them. The wards were full in ways they had not been full before. Not crowded, organized, still, because organization was the one thing I could control, but full in a way that required constant adjustment, constant recalculation of what space existed and what space was needed. He arrived with a group of 8. I was at the intake desk when they came in. I looked up from the ledger and began the count, the automatic count, the one I did without thinking by then, registering number and approximate condition before I had processed anything else. 8. Most walking. 2 on stretchers. 1 very small. He was at the back of the group, standing on his own, which suggested he could stand, which I noted. Wearing a uniform that had been taken in at the shoulders, I could see the stitching from where I sat, amateur work, done quickly. He was holding his left arm against his body in the careful way of someone managing pain they have decided not to show. I put his age at 11, perhaps 12. No older than that. I had spent 3 years looking at bodies with the attention of someone whose work depended on accurate assessment, and there was no reading of this one that gave me more than 12. I finished the intake for the others first. Then I came to him. He gave me his name and unit without being asked. His voice had not yet broken. It had the particular quality of a boy's voice that is trying to be lower than it is, the effort visible in the set of his jaw. He told me his arm had been struck by something during a skirmish 3 days prior. He used the word skirmish precisely, the way someone uses a word they have recently learned. He told me he had continued on for the 3 days because there had not been opportunity to stop. I asked him his age. He said 14. I wrote 14 in the ledger. I did not look at him while I wrote it. His arm was broken. A clean fracture, Dr. Ferreira said, the kind that heals well in the young, which was the one useful thing about the situation. He would need 6 weeks. Maybe 8. I thought, 8 weeks. 8 weeks, and then what? 8 weeks, and he goes back. Because by then, that was what happened. Men recovered and returned, because there was nothing else to do with them. Because Lopez needed what he had, and what he had was becoming insufficient, and so the threshold for what counted as recovered was moving in one direction only. He was not the last. That is what I want to be precise about. He was not an exception, he was a beginning. Over the months that followed, I would see more of them. Boys of 12, 13, 14 in uniforms that had been altered to fit smaller frames. Some with the beginnings of beards, real ones, sparse and uneven. Some, I would learn later, with charcoal darkened on their upper lips, applied before inspection, to suggest what was not yet there. Lopez had begun conscripting boys. Not quietly. There was no quiet left by then, no pretense that the army was what it had been. The men were gone in numbers that could no longer be managed by adjusting the columns in a ledger. What remained was what remained. And what remained increasingly was the very young and the very old, and the women who had not yet been asked. The word asked is wrong. No one was asked. I kept the records. I kept them carefully, the way I had always kept them: name, age, unit, wound, treatment, outcome. The age column was where the war showed itself most clearly by then, not in the nature of the wounds, which had always been various, not in the numbers, which had always been difficult, in the ages, in the way the ages in that column were moving, steadily, quietly, in the wrong direction. I thought about Eduardo. He was 19 by then. He had been in Asunción at the start of the year. I had received one letter from him in the spring, brief, careful, the letter of a young man who has been told to be reassuring and is doing his best. He said he was well. He said I should not worry. He said that things were difficult, but that he believed they would improve. He did not say where he was writing from. I looked at the boy with the broken arm. He was asleep by then, the deep sleep of the very young and the very exhausted, the kind of sleep that looks almost peaceful from a distance. His hands were small. I had noticed that when I took his pulse. The hands of a child, still, the knuckles not yet set in the way adult knuckles set, the fingers narrow and unfinished. Hands that had been holding a rifle. I closed the ledger. I did not go back to it until the following morning. That was unusual for me. I noted it and said nothing about it, even to myself. They began burning the archives in August. Not all of them. The ones they could not carry. The ones that existed in single copies, in rooms that would not be locked again after the last person left them. I watched the smoke from the hospital window for 2 mornings before I understood what it was. Not a fire, not an accident, but a decision. The deliberate erasure of records that someone had decided should not fall into Allied hands. Asunción was being abandoned. Not all at once. Nothing that year happened all at once. It happened the way water leaves a vessel with a crack in it, steadily, without drama, the level dropping so gradually that you kept thinking it had stabilized until the day you looked and understood it had not. Families left first. Then the government offices. Then the men who had reasons to follow the government. Then the men who had reasons to follow those men. What remained was what could not leave or would not. Women, mostly. Children. The old. And those of us whose work was tied to a place, the hospital, the remaining supply depots, the functions that a city requires, even when the city is ceasing to be itself. Lopez had moved north, into the interior, where he believed, or where he had decided to believe, that the terrain would favor the defense. that the Allies would not follow into the forests and the hills, that there was still a war to be fought on terms that could produce a different outcome. He took with him what remained of the army. What remained of the army was not what had left Asunción in 1864. I stood at the hospital entrance on the morning the last column passed through the city. I had not intended to watch. I had work to do. There was always work to do, and the work had become more pressing as the staff had thinned, as the physicians who had remained as long as they could began to make decisions about what they could no longer remain for. But I heard the movement in the street, and I went to the entrance, and I stood there. It was not like the departure of 1864. There were no bands, no flowers, no women leaning from windows. The street was nearly empty. The people who remained in Asunción had learned by then that some things were better not witnessed directly. Or perhaps they were simply tired. Tired in the way that goes below the body, into something harder to name. The column was smaller than I had expected. That was the first thing. And then the second thing, the faces. I had spent 4 years looking at the faces of soldiers, learning to read them the way I read intake records, quickly for information, with the part of the mind that registers what the rest of the mind is not ready to process. These faces were different from the ones I had seen in 1864. Not older, though they were older. Something else. The particular expression of people who have stopped calculating the distance to the end. I looked for Eduardo. I do not know what I expected. He could have been anywhere by then. I had not had a letter in 4 months, which I had been managing by not thinking about it directly, by keeping the not thinking organized and deliberate the way I kept everything else. I looked anyway. The way you look for someone in a crowd, when you know the odds are against you, but the looking is the only thing available. I did not find him. The column passed. It took less time than it should have, given how long the 1864 departure had taken. That was its own kind of information. I stood at the entrance until the last of them had gone, and then I stood a moment longer, looking at the empty street. The smoke from the archives was still rising to the east. Thinner now, most of what was going to burn had burned. What remained in those rooms was ash and the smell of paper, and the shapes of things that had been there long enough to leave impressions in the dust around them. I went back inside. There were patients who needed attending, supplies that needed inventorying, records that needed to be kept even now, especially now, when everything else was being destroyed or abandoned or carried north into an interior that was not going to save anyone. Someone had to stay. Someone had to keep the record of what was happening to this place and these people. I had been keeping records for 4 years. I was still there. The conclusion was not complicated. That evening, I opened the ledger to a new page. At the top, I wrote the date. Below it, I wrote the number of patients remaining in the hospital. Below that, the number of staff. Below that, the inventory of supplies, what we had, what we needed, the ratio between the two, which was not by then a comfortable ratio. I did not write Andres's name. I had not written it in the ledger since the beginning. It was not the kind of record that had a column for the names of the people you were waiting for. But I had found it that afternoon in another record. A transfer document from 3 months prior. His name in someone else's handwriting, in a column I had not expected to find it in. I closed the ledger. Outside, Asunción was quiet in the way of a place that has just become something other than what it was. Not destroyed, not yet. Simply emptied. The shape of a city, without the weight of one. I sat at my desk until it was dark. Then I lit the lamp and went back to work. If you are still here, still inside this story, tell me where you are and what time it is where you are. You are part of this archive now. The order arrived on a Tuesday. Not delivered to me personally. Nothing was delivered personally by then, because the structures that had once organized such things had followed the government north, or had simply stopped functioning in the way structures stop functioning when the people who maintain them are no longer there to maintain them. The order was posted on the wall of the hospital entrance, where notices had always been posted, as if the war had agreed to observe at least that much continuity. I read it twice before I moved. Women between the ages of 15 and 45 were required to report for auxiliary service. The language was precise in the way that language is precise when the people writing it understand that imprecision will produce questions they do not want to answer. Auxiliary service, transport of supplies, field support, medical assistance where required. I was already providing medical assistance. I noted this to Dr. Ferreira, who was standing beside me when I read the notice, who had almost certainly read it before I arrived. He said that my current position would satisfy the requirement, that I would not need to relocate immediately, that immediately was the word he used, and that I should attend to what that word meant. Within 6 weeks the hospital had been moved. Not the building. Buildings do not move, which was the one advantage they had over everything else by then. The patients, the supplies, the staff, the ledgers, all of it relocated north, into the interior, following the line of Lopez's retreat, with the particular logic of institutions that exist to serve an army, and must therefore go where the army goes. I packed the ledgers myself. Every one of them, from the first year to the current pages. I packed them in the order they had been kept, chronological, careful, the way I had maintained them. The box was heavier than I expected. 4 years of names and dates and outcomes, compressed into something I could carry. I also packed the letters. The ones from Andres, in their box. The one from Eduardo, the single one, still without a return address. I did not read them before I packed them. I had learnt by then that there were times for reading and times for moving, and that confusing the two cost something you could not afford to spend. The road north was not what I had imagined. I do not know what I had imagined. Something more orderly, perhaps. The organized movement of people with a destination. What I found instead was a procession that had the shape of organization without the substance of it. Carts and people on foot and animals and children, and the particular noise of many people moving together without quite knowing where they are going or when they will arrive. The women were everywhere. That was what struck me most in those first days on the road. Not the absence of men. I had been living with that absence for long enough that it had become the texture of things, unremarkable in the way that constant conditions become unremarkable. What struck me was the presence of the women. How many there were. How much they were carrying. How they moved, with the particular efficiency of people who have understood that efficiency is now their responsibility and no one else's. They carried supplies on their backs and heads. They managed the animals. They kept the children moving when the children wanted to stop. They dug when digging was required, and built when building was required, and buried when burying was required. They did these things without being asked, which is to say they did them because they understood that if they did not, no one would. I walked among them, and I kept my records. That is what I had to offer, the records. The names and the numbers and the dates, the account of what was happening to these people in this place at this time. Someone had to keep it. The army was keeping its own records, such as they were. the military ledgers that tracked units and movements and casualties in the language of strategy. But the women on the road had no ledger. No one was recording what they carried, what they built, what they buried. I started a new section in the current ledger. Not an official section. There was no official category for what I was recording. I created one. At the top of the page I wrote a single word that I will not repeat here because it was a private word between me and the ledger. Below it I began to write names. The women of the road. What they carried. What they did. What happened to them. It was not the record anyone had asked me to keep. It was the one that needed keeping. On the third night, camped at the edge of a forest whose name I did not know, I opened the box of letters. Not to read them. Just to confirm they were still there. That the things I was carrying were still the things I had packed. They were. I closed the box and lay down beside it. Above me, the forest made the sounds forests make at night. The particular language of things that do not know there is a war. I listened to it for a while. Then I stopped listening and went to sleep. Because tomorrow the road would continue. And the day after that. And someone had to be rested enough to keep the record of it. There was a night, somewhere in the interior, when I counted. Not the supplies. I counted those every morning automatically, the way breathing is automatic. I counted the people around the camp. Everyone I could see from where I sat, at the edge of the fire, with the ledger open on my knees and the pen in my hand, and the particular stillness that comes after a long day on the road when the body has stopped, but the mind has not. I counted 112 people, 11 men, the rest women, children, the very old. I wrote the number in the margin. Not in any official column. The official columns were for other things. In the margin, in small numbers, the way you write something, you are not certain you have the right to make permanent. 112. 11. I had known, in the abstract, what the war had done to the population. I had kept the intake records. I had watched the age column move in its slow, terrible direction. I had seen the faces of the men who came back and the spaces where the men who did not come back had been. I had understood it as a physician understands a condition, clinically, accurately, with the part of the mind that processes information before the rest of the mind decides what to do with it. But sitting at that fire, counting 112 people and finding 11 men among them, I understood it differently. Not as information, as fact. The women around that fire were not auxiliaries. That was the word the order had used, auxiliary, as if they were supplementary to something primary that still existed. But the primary thing no longer existed. The men were gone, not all of them, not everywhere, but enough. Enough that what remained could not function as it had functioned before. Enough that the women were not supplementing anything. They were the thing itself. They carried the ammunition. I had seen this with my own eyes. Women moving through the camps with loads that I could not have carried, moving quickly without complaint, because complaint required energy that had been allocated elsewhere. They built the field fortifications, earthworks, trenches, the rudimentary structures that the army required to slow the Allied advance. They cooked for soldiers who were often younger than their own children. They nursed the wounded with what was available, which was less each week. They buried the dead when there was time to bury them, and marked the graves when there was something to mark them with. And some of them fought. I will be precise about this, because precision is what it deserves. Not all, not most, but some, women who had arrived at the camps as carriers or nurses and had, by increments that I imagine felt inevitable to them at the time, become something the war had not initially asked them to be. I treated 3 of them in the field hospital in those months. Wounds consistent with combat. I noted it in the ledger in the same column I used for everyone else. There was no separate column. I did not create one. A woman named Rosario worked alongside me for most of that period. She had been a school teacher in a village whose name she mentioned once and did not mention again. She had a husband somewhere in the north, she thought. She had not received word in 8 months. She said this the way people say things they have decided to hold at a certain distance, not denying, not accepting, simply maintaining the gap until the gap resolved itself or didn't. She was the most competent person I worked with in those months. I include the physicians in that assessment. She learned quickly, remembered everything, made decisions in the field without hesitation and without error, or without the kind of error that mattered, which is the only standard worth applying when the conditions are what they were. She had no medical training. She had, apparently, an aptitude for necessity. I asked her once how she managed it. The composure, the steadiness in circumstances that I, who had been doing this for years, still found difficult to be steady in. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. She said that she had decided early on that the war was going to take what it was going to take, that she could not prevent that. That what she could do was be useful in the space between what the war took and what it left. And that being useful required not spending energy on the distance between what was happening and what should have been happening. She said she saved that for the nights when the work was done and there was nothing left to be useful for. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the nights she had spent in that space, the space between what was happening and what should have been. How large that space had become, how much it held, how many women were spending their nights in it, alone, without anyone to account for what it cost them. I went back to the ledger. I found the page where I had written the names, the women of the road, what they carried, what they did, what happened to them. I added Rosario, her name, her village, her husband, somewhere in the north, her aptitude for necessity. Below her name I wrote what she had said to me. Not in the official columns. In the margin. Small. Permanent. It was the least the ledger could do. He was brought to me on a morning when the rain had not stopped for 3 days. The field hospital by then was a series of canvas structures arranged along the edge of a clearing, not what hospital should be, but what a hospital could be, given what was available and what was not. The rain came through in places. I had learned which places and positioned the patients accordingly, which was the kind of knowledge that felt like competence and was actually just adaptation. The difference between the two had become difficult to maintain. They said he had been found at the edge of the previous night's skirmish. Alive, which was the first surprise. Conscious, which was the second. He had been separated from his unit, or what remained of his unit, the distinction between a unit and its remainder having compressed considerably by then, and had made his way toward the camp on his own, in the dark, in the rain. He was 10 years old. I know this because I asked him directly, the way I had learned to ask directly, because the answers I received when I asked indirectly were not always the answers that would help me treat what needed treating. He told me 10 without hesitation. Then he looked at me as if he expected me to write something different in the ledger, and when I did not, when I wrote 10, exactly as he had said, something in his face changed in a way I did not have a word for then, and do not have a word for now. His wounds were not from combat. That was what the examination revealed. Not a rifle wound, not a blade. He had fallen, in the dark and the rain, and the falling had done what falling does. A gash along his left forearm, deep enough to need closing. Bruising across his ribs that suggested he had hit something solid on the way down. His feet, when I removed his boots, which were too large for him, stuffed with cloth at the toe to compensate. His feet had blisters that had opened and closed, and opened again over what must have been many days of walking. I treated the arm first. He did not make a sound. Not during the cleaning, which I will not describe, and not during the closing, which I will also not describe. He watched what I was doing with the focused attention of a child who has decided that watching is better than not watching, that knowing what is happening is preferable to imagining it. I recognized that. I had made the same decision myself years before, in a different context. While I worked, I asked him questions. Not about the war, about other things. Where he was from, whether he had family, what he had done before. The questions you ask a child to give them somewhere to put their attention while you do something that requires their stillness. He was from a village 2 days south. His mother was there, or had been when he left. He had a sister, younger. He had not been home in 4 months. He said 4 months, the way children say large numbers, with a slight uncertainty, as if the magnitude of it had not yet resolved into something his experience could fully measure. I asked him how he had come to be with the army. He said that they had come to the village, that they had taken the older boys first, and then, when there were not enough older boys, the others. He said this without effect, not because it had not affected him, I think, but because he had been living with it long enough that it had become the condition of things, rather than an event within the condition of things. I finished with the arm. I moved to the feet. His hands were in his lap while I worked. I had noticed them when he arrived. I noticed hands by then automatically, the way I noticed ages and wounds, as part of the intake, the assessment. They were small. Not unusually small for a child of 10. They were exactly the size that hands are at 10, which is to say, they were the hands of a child, still forming, the knuckles soft, the fingers narrow in the way that fingers are narrow before the work of years shapes them into something else. On the right hand, between the thumb and forefinger, there was a callus, the kind that forms from sustained repetitive pressure. The kind I had seen on the hands of men who had been carrying rifles for months. On a hand that was otherwise entirely a child's hand, soft, unfinished, still in the process of becoming. I looked at it for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went back to the feet. Rosario was working at the other end of the tent. She glanced over once, not at the boy, at me. The look of someone checking whether you are managing. I gave her the small nod that meant yes, which was the vocabulary we had developed over months of working in conditions that did not leave room for longer answers. She nodded back and returned to her work. When I had finished, I told the boy to rest, that the arm would heal cleanly if he kept it dry, which was difficult in the rain but not impossible. That his feet needed 2 days off the road, minimum, before they could be walked on again without making things worse. He listened to all of this with the same focused attention he had given the treatment. Then he asked me when he would be able to return to his unit. I told him to rest first, that we would discuss the rest later. He accepted this. Lay back. Was asleep within minutes. The sleep of the very young and the very exhausted. The same sleep I had seen on the boy with the broken arm, months before, in a different hospital, in a city that no longer existed in the form it had existed then. I sat for a moment after he fell asleep. I looked at his hands in his lap. The right one on top. The callus between the thumb and forefinger. Then I opened the ledger, and I did not write what I was thinking. I wrote his name, his age, his village, the nature of his wounds and the treatment administered. The official columns. Only the official columns. Some things the ledger was not the right place for. The hunger arrived gradually, and then all at once. That is the way of it. Not a single moment of deprivation, but an accumulation of small subtractions, each one manageable, each one absorbed into the new normal of what was available, until the day you look at what remains and understand that the subtractions have compounded into something that cannot be absorbed anymore. The Allied blockade had been effective since the fall of Asunción. What Lopez had in the interior was what he had carried north. Supplies that had seemed sufficient when calculated against a campaign of months, and that were no longer sufficient because the campaign had exceeded every calculation made for it. The medical supplies were the first to show it. Not dramatically. There was no single morning when the dispensary was empty. There was instead a morning when I noted that the dressing supplies were at a third of what the patient load required, and a week later when they were at a fifth, and a week after that when I was making decisions. I will not describe about which wounds could be dressed and which would have to be managed differently. The food followed the same logic. Reduced rations first, the official reduction, the one that came with a notification. Then the unofficial reduction, the one that did not come with a notification, but that anyone maintaining supply records could see arriving weeks before it arrived. Then the period that came after the unofficial reduction, which had no name because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required decisions that no one in a position to make them was prepared to make. I watched the patients closely during those months. Not just their wounds I had always watched. Their bodies. The particular changes that insufficient nutrition produces over time. The way the face reorganizes itself. The way the eyes change. The way the body begins to consume what it has stored, and then what it cannot afford to lose. I noted it in the ledger. Not in the official columns. There was no official column for what I was recording. In the margin, where I had been recording things the official columns had no room for. The deaths from disease exceeded the deaths from combat that winter. I know this because I counted both. Not because anyone had asked me to produce that comparison. No one had asked me to produce it, which was perhaps why I felt it necessary to produce it myself. The army tracked its combat losses with the attention of an institution for which those numbers had strategic significance. The other losses, disease, hunger, the slow attrition of bodies that had been given insufficient resources for too long, those were recorded but not compared, not analyzed, not placed beside the combat figures in a way that would reveal the ratio. The ratio was not a comfortable one. It was during this period that I found Andres's name. I was working through a set of transfer documents that had arrived with a supply convoy, military records that had been consolidated somewhere north and were being redistributed to the relevant field hospitals for cross-referencing. Routine administrative work, the kind that accumulates when institutions are functioning under pressure and the people maintaining them are doing several jobs at once. I had been working through the documents for most of the afternoon. It was close to the end of the stack when I found it. His name, his rank, his unit, and beside them, in the column that indicated the reason for the record's inclusion in the transfer documents, a notation in the standard military abbreviation that I had learned to read in the first year of the war. I sat with the document for a long time. Not reading it, I had read it. One reading had been sufficient. I sat with it the way you sit with something when the sitting is all that is available to you, and you are not yet ready to move to what comes after the sitting. Outside the tent, the camp continued. The sounds of it, the movement, the voices, the particular noise of a large group of people existing under difficult conditions, continued without pause, because the camp did not know what I had just read, and would not have paused if it had, because there was nothing left to pause for. Every person in that camp had a document somewhere. Every person in that camp was waiting for one, or had already received one, or had decided to stop waiting, because waiting had become its own kind of answer. I placed the document in the stack with the others. I did not put it aside. I did not keep it separately. I placed it exactly where it belonged, in the administrative record, in sequence, in order. Because that was what I did. That was what I had always done. And because the alternative, removing it from the record, treating it as something other than what it was, which was a document among documents, the alternative felt like a form of dishonesty I was not willing to commit. The record was the record. It did not become something else because of whose name was in it. I finished the stack. I cross-referenced the relevant entries with the hospital ledger. I noted the discrepancies, of which there were several, and set them aside for follow-up. I closed the ledger. Then I went to find Rosario. Not to tell her. I did not tell her. I found her because I needed to be near someone who understood what the work cost, and did not require an explanation of why I needed to be near her. She was at the supply table, inventorying what remained of the dressings. I sat beside her and helped with the inventory. We counted in silence, item by item. The way you count things when the number matters, and you cannot afford to be wrong. When we finished, she wrote the total in her notebook. I wrote it in mine. We compared them, the same number, which meant we had both counted correctly, which was the one thing that day that had gone as it should. She did not ask me what was wrong. I did not tell her. We put the dressings back in the correct order and went back to work. I heard Lopez speak once. Only once, in all the years of the war. He passed through the camp in late 1868, not a visit exactly. A movement. The kind of passage that a commander makes when he needs to be seen moving through his forces, when visibility is itself a form of argument. We were told he would speak. That attendance was expected. In 1868, expected had a weight to it that it had not carried in earlier years. I went. The clearing they had chosen was large enough to hold several hundred people. It was not full. I noted this automatically, the way I noted numbers. The people who were there stood in the particular arrangement of people who have been directed to stand somewhere and are complying without quite committing to the compliance. Soldiers. Women from the camp. Some children. A row of officers at the front, whose faces I could not read from where I stood. Lopez arrived without the ceremony that had once accompanied his appearances. I had heard descriptions of his earlier addresses, the formality of them, the staging, the deliberate construction of authority through detail and protocol. What arrived in that clearing in late 1868 was a man on a horse, attended by a reduced guard, wearing a uniform that was correct but not immaculate. He was heavier than I had expected from the descriptions. His face was the face of a man who had not slept adequately in a long time, and had decided that this was now simply his face. He spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I will not tell you what he said. Not because I have forgotten, I have not forgotten. But because the words, written down now, would sound like one thing, and what they were in that clearing, in late 1868, was another thing entirely. Words exist inside their conditions. Remove the conditions, and you remove the truth of them. Not the content, but the truth. What I will tell you is the voice. It was not what I had expected. I had constructed, over years of the war, an idea of what the voice of a man who had done what Lopez had done would sound like. Something harder, perhaps. Something that carried its own weight differently. What I heard instead was a voice that was, and I have considered this word carefully over many years, and I believe it is the correct one, a voice that was tired. Not weak. Tired is not weak. Tired is what remains after a long time of being something, when the being has cost more than was initially calculated, and the calculation cannot be revised, because revising it would require admitting what the revision meant. Tired is the voice of a man who is committed to a direction and cannot turn around, not because the way back is blocked, but because turning around would require him to see what is behind him. He spoke about Paraguay, about what it had been and what it would be again, about the alliance that had tried to destroy it and had not succeeded. This in late 1868, with Asunción fallen and the army reduced to what stood in that clearing and the fields around it. He spoke about the honor of resistance, about what the nation owed its history, about what history would say of those who had endured. The people around me listened. I watched them listening. The soldiers, the ones who remained, the boys and the old men, and the few in between who had survived this far. They listened with their bodies very still, the stillness of people who were conserving something. The women listened differently, with a quality of attention I recognized because I had seen it in the hospital, in patients receiving a prognosis. The focused, careful attention of people gathering information they will need to act on, filtering it for what is useful and what is not. When he finished, there was a pause. Not long, a few seconds perhaps. But in a gathering of several hundred people, a few seconds of complete silence is not nothing. It is, in fact, a response. The most honest response available when the alternatives are performances that no one has the energy to perform convincingly. Then someone began, and the others followed, and the clearing filled with the sound that clearings fill with on such occasions. I did not add to it. I am not certain anyone noticed. I'm not certain it mattered. What I thought standing there was this. I thought of the general who had died in the hospital in October of 1865. His 6-day assessment of what was happening, delivered quietly, to a woman with a pulse counter and a ledger, in the particular honesty available to men who believe they are close to the end. A war fought from fear has no shape, only momentum. I looked at Lopez on his horse, at the tired voice still moving through the clearing, settling into the trees at the edge, at the people around me, still and listening and filtering. The momentum had been going for 4 years. It would go for 4 more months. I walked back to the hospital tent without waiting for the formal conclusion of the address. There were dressings to be changed. There were records to be updated. There were people in the tent who needed what I could give them, which was less than they needed and more than nothing, which was the arithmetic of those months. I did not write about Lopez in the ledger that evening. I wrote about the dressings, about the supply levels, about the 3 patients whose conditions had changed since morning and the adjustments made in response. The official columns. Only the official columns. Lopez would find his way into the record eventually. History has a ledger of its own. It keeps what it keeps and loses what it loses, and the margins are filled with things that no official column was designed to hold. I knew which ledger I trusted more. There was a village we passed through in January of 1869. I do not remember its name. It may not have had one by then, or rather, it may have had one, that no one who remained there could tell me, because the people who remained there were not, for the most part, people who had been there long enough to know its name. They had arrived the way people arrived everywhere in the interior by then, carried by the logic of retreat, deposited by the movement of an army that was no longer moving toward anything but away from everything. We stopped there for 2 days. Supply reasons, a cache that had been left by an earlier column, which needed to be inventoried and redistributed before we continued north. I used the time the way I used all stop time by then, to update the records, to treat what could be treated with what was available, to sleep in something closer to a horizontal position than the road allowed. On the second morning, I walked through the village. Not for any purpose. Or for the purpose that walking without destination sometimes serves. The need to see what is there, to register it with the body as well as the mind, to know a place through movement rather than through the ledger's version of it. The village was small, perhaps 40 structures, some intact, some not. The ones that were intact had been occupied. Fires recently used, evidence of habitation. The small arrangements that people make when they have decided, however provisionally, that a place is where they are. The ones that were not intact had not been destroyed deliberately. They had simply been left. And leaving had done what leaving does over time, the slow return of structure to its components. I counted the people I saw. It had become a habit by then, not a conscious decision, but an automatic response, the way a physician takes a pulse without thinking about taking it. I counted because counting was how I understood what I was looking at. Because the numbers told me things that observation alone did not. In 40 minutes of walking through that village, I counted 63 people. I counted them by category, the way I counted everything. Women, 38. Children under 12, 19. Elderly. I set the threshold at 60, which by then was a conservative estimate given what the previous 5 years had done to the bodies of people in their 50s. Elderly, 4. Men between 15 and 50, to 2. I stood in the center of the village with that number. 2. One of them was sitting outside a structure near the well. He had lost a leg below the knee, a recent amputation, still healing, the kind of wound that explained why he was here rather than further north with what remained of the army. He was perhaps 30. He was watching me with the particular attention of someone who has learned to assess strangers quickly, who has calibrated the calculation of threat and not threat to a speed that normal life does not require. The other I did not see directly. I saw evidence of him, a coat on a post outside one of the intact structures, tools recently used near a garden plot that someone was attempting to maintain. Evidence of a man without the man, which was a thing I had become practiced at reading. 63 people. 2 men of fighting age. One of them unable to fight. I had known the numbers in the abstract for years. The population figures, the casualty estimates, the calculations that historians and military analysts would make later, when there was a later, and people with the distance to make them. Paraguay had begun the war with a population of perhaps 500,000. The estimates of what it would end with varied. They varied because the counting had broken down long before the war ended, because the infrastructure required for counting had been consumed by the thing being counted. Some said half. Some said less. Among the men specifically, some said 9 in 10. 9 in 10. I had written that figure in the margin of the ledger months before. Not as a confirmed number. It could not be confirmed, not then, perhaps not ever with precision, as a direction. The direction the columns were pointing extrapolated forward to where they were going. Standing in that village, counting 2 men among 63 people, I was no longer extrapolating. I was looking at the extrapolation made real. I thought about what this village would be in 10 years. In 20. The children I had counted, 19 of them, below 12, they would grow. The girls would become women, the way girls do, and they would build what they could build with what was there. The boys, 11 of them, I had counted separately. The boys would become men in a country that had lost most of its men, in a generation that would carry that loss, not as memory, but as the simple arithmetic of who was there and who was not. The man by the well was still watching me. I walked over to him, asked if he needed medical attention. He looked at the wound and then at me and said that he had been told it was healing. I examined it briefly. He was right. It was healing, slowly but correctly. I told him so. He nodded. Did not thank me. I did not require thanks. Before I left him, I asked how long the village had been like this. He said he did not know exactly, that it had been a gradual thing, that he had arrived 6 months ago, and it had already been mostly women then, that since he had arrived, he had watched the few remaining men leave, some called up, some simply gone, in the direction men go when they have decided that staying is no longer something they can do. He said, and he said it without bitterness, which was the part that stayed with me. He said that the women had managed better than he would have expected. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the village around us, at the fires recently used, at the garden plots being maintained, at the structures that were intact because someone had kept them intact, at the children moving between the buildings with the purposeful movement of children who have been given tasks and are carrying them out. I thought about what he meant by better than he would have expected. I thought about what that expectation revealed. I did not say any of this. I wished him continued healing and walked back to the camp. That evening, I opened the ledger to the margin section. The pages I had been filling since the road north, the names, the numbers, the things the official columns had no room for. I wrote 63. 2. And then, below that, in smaller writing, the number I had been avoiding writing for months. Not because I did not know it. Because writing it made it the kind of thing that exists outside of you, fixed, permanent, no longer a direction the columns were pointing, but a place the columns had arrived. I wrote it. Then I closed the ledger and did not open it again until morning. I was not at Cerro Corá. I want to be precise about that from the beginning. Not because precision changes what happened, but because the difference between what I witnessed and what I received matters to me, and I think it should matter to you. I was 2 days south when the final engagement took place. Close enough that the news arrived quickly. Not close enough to have seen any of it. What I know from a woman named Concepcion. She had been with Lopez's personal camp in the final weeks, not by choice exactly, though by then the distinction between choice and the absence of it had become academic. She was perhaps 40. A woman who had survived the entire war in the way that some people survive things, not by being protected from them, but by moving through them with a quality of attention that kept her alive when others were not. She arrived at our camp 3 days after Cerro Corá, on foot, with a wound on her forearm that she had dressed herself with cloth torn from the hem of her skirt. I treated the wound. While I worked, she talked. Not immediately. Not with the compulsive urgency of someone who needs to discharge what they have seen. She talked the way people talk when they have decided that talking is the responsible thing to do, that what they witnessed belongs to a record larger than themselves, and that maintaining it in silence would be a form of negligence. She was precise. She repeated herself only to correct herself, to refine a detail, to distinguish between what she had seen directly and what she had been told by someone who had seen it. The 1st of March, 1870. The Brazilian forces had located Lopez's camp at Cerro Corá, in the hills of the far northeast, where he had retreated with what remained of his army and the civilians who had followed it north. What remained was not what had been. Concepcion said there were perhaps several hundred soldiers. She would not give me a precise number because she said she had not counted and did not want to estimate and be wrong about something that deserved to be right. I noted this. I found it in the circumstances an admirable scruple. The Brazilian force that arrived was larger, significantly larger. The engagement, such as it was, did not last long. Lopez fled toward the river. Concepcion said he was on horseback. That he was wounded, she had seen this, a saber wound, she thought, though she could not be certain of the weapon at the distance she was at. That he continued despite the wound, which she said without admiration or condemnation, simply as information. That he reached the edge of the Equidaban-Nigui River. He was taken there. Concepcion paused when she reached this part. Not long, a breath. The kind of pause that marks a transition rather than a hesitation. Then she continued. She said that what he said at the end had been reported to her by a man who had been close enough to hear it. That she could not verify it personally. That she was passing it on as something reported rather than something witnessed, and that I should record it as such. She said he had spoken in Spanish. That he had said, and she recited it carefully, the way you recite something you have committed to memory because you understand it will be asked for, that he died with his country. I wrote it in the ledger, with the notation she had requested, reported, not witnessed. The distinction she had insisted on. The distinction that matters. When I had finished writing, I sat for a moment with the pen still in my hand. Concepcion was looking at her arm, at the dressing I had applied, testing its edges with the careful attention of someone who intends to rely on it and wants to be certain it will hold. I thought about what she had said. The phrase. What it meant, or what it was intended to mean. A man at the edge of a river, wounded, surrounded, saying that he died with his country. I thought about the village with 63 people and 2 men. About the boy of 10, with the callus between his thumb and forefinger. About the box of letters beneath the bed in a house in Asunción, that may or may not still exist. About Rosario's husband somewhere in the north, unaccounted for. About the column that had left Asunción in 1864 with flowers pressed into their hands. About the ledger. What it held. What the margins held. What no ledger in existence held, because the counting had broken down long before the end, because the infrastructure for counting had been consumed by the thing being counted. He died with his country. I put the pen down. I looked at Concepcion. I said, and I had not planned to say it, it arrived the way true things sometimes arrive, without announcement. I said that the country had not died with him. She looked at me. I said that the country had already been dying for years before that river. That what died at Cerro Corá was the last official version of something that had in truth been ending since before Asunción fell, since before Chiuti, since before the fleet at Riachuelo. That the country, the actual country, the people, the women on the road, and the boys with calloused hands, and the villages with 2 men among 60, That country had been carrying the dying for a long time before Lopez reached the river. And that it was still there. Diminished. Altered in ways that would take generations to understand. But there. Concepcion was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she supposed that was right. She said it simply. Without ceremony. The way you say things that are true and do not require decoration. I closed the ledger. Outside the tent, the camp was beginning to understand what had happened. The news was moving through it in the way news moves through a closed community, not announced, but absorbed, person to person, in the particular silence of people receiving information they have been waiting for and are not certain how to hold now that it has arrived. I sat with Concepcion until the dressing had been checked and the instructions given, and there was nothing more that my work required of the moment. Then I stepped outside. The war was over. The country was not. The road back to Asunción took 11 days. I had walked it in the other direction 2 years before, north, with the hospital and the ledgers and the box of letters, following the logic of retreat into an interior that had not saved anyone. Walking it south felt different in ways I had not anticipated. Not easier. The body was not in a condition to find things easier by then. Different in the way that the same road walked in opposite directions is always a different road. The landmarks arrive in a different order. The light falls from a different angle. You see the backs of things you had previously seen only from the front. Rosario walked with me for the first 7 days. Then she turned east, toward the village she had mentioned once and not mentioned again, toward whatever remained of what she had left there. We said goodbye at a crossroads that had no marker, no name, nothing to distinguish it from any other point on any other road, except that it was where we stopped walking in the same direction. She embraced me. I held her for a moment. Then she walked east, and I walked south, and I did not look back. Not because I did not want to, but because looking back felt like a form of doubt, and I had used all my doubt on things that deserved it more. I arrived in Asunción on a morning in April. I had been preparing myself for what I would find. Not consciously. There is a kind of preparation that happens without instruction, the mind constructing and revising its expectations in the background, while the body does what the body must do. I had been revising my expectations for 11 days. I thought I had arrived at something realistic. I had not. The city was there. That was the first thing. It was still there, which was not something I had been certain of. The Allies had occupied it for more than a year by then, and occupations produced different results depending on factors I had not been in a position to assess from the interior. The buildings were mostly standing. The streets were in the places I remembered. But the weight was wrong. That is the only way I know to describe it. The city had the same shape, the same streets, the same buildings, the same arrangement of space that I had known since childhood. But a city is not only its shape. A city is also its weight, the accumulated density of the people who inhabit it, the noise and movement and particular friction of many lives existing in proximity. Asunción had the shape. The weight was gone. I walked through streets I had walked through 10,000 times. I counted, automatically. The habit of years. On the street where I had grown up, there were perhaps a dozen people visible in the space of 2 blocks, a number that, before the war, would have seemed like early morning on a public holiday. The city briefly emptied of itself. It was mid-morning. It was not a holiday. Most of the people I saw were women, some with children. A few elderly men, moving with the careful economy of people for whom movement has become a calculation. Brazilian soldiers at certain corners, the occupying force, present but not aggressive, at least not in what I witnessed that morning. They watched me pass. I watched them back. We had nothing to say to each other that the situation had not already said. I went to the house. I had not allowed myself to think about the house during the 11 days on the road. Not as a prohibition, I had not forbidden myself. I simply had not gone there, in my mind, because the mind has limits on what it can productively anticipate, and the house was beyond those limits. The street was intact. The houses on either side were standing. The garden I had planted before the war, the jasmine I had mentioned to Andres in that letter, the one written the night the first wounded arrived from Mato Grosso. The garden had grown beyond its borders. Untended for 2 years, it had done what plants do when no one is managing them: expanded, overreached, covered what it was not supposed to cover. The door was open. Not broken, not forced. Simply open. Standing open the way doors stand when someone has passed through them recently and not yet returned, or when someone passed through them a long time ago and there was no one left to close them after. I stood at the threshold for a moment. Inside, the rooms were, as I had left them, mostly. Some things had been moved or taken. Not violently. There was no evidence of violence, no sense of intrusion by force. The kind of taking that happens in wars gradually, when objects migrate toward whoever needs them and away from whoever no longer does. What remained was what had not been needed elsewhere. The box of letters was not there. I had carried it with me. I knew this. I had carried it north, and I had carried it back. It was in my bag. It had been with me every day of the 2 years. But standing in the room where I had packed it, where it had lived under the bed for the years before that, I felt its absence in the room as something separate from its presence in my bag. The room missed it. Or I missed it being where it had been. The distinction, again, was difficult to maintain. I sat down in the chair by the window. The same chair I had sat in to write the letters to Andres. The one where I had read his letters when they came. The light came through the window at the same angle it had always come at that time of morning. That, at least, had not changed. The jasmine outside had grown across part of the window. A branch of it, reaching further than it was supposed to reach. It filtered the light slightly, not much, just enough to notice. I looked at it for a while. I had not cried during the war. I want to be precise about that, the way I have tried to be precise about everything. Not because I was not affected. I was affected in ways that I am still, now, accounting for. But the war had not left room for it, and I had learned, early, that the room it would have taken was room I needed for other things. Sitting in that chair, with the light coming through the jasmine at the angle it had always come, I understood that the room was available now. I sat in it for a long time. Then I got up. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The work had simply changed its nature, from the work of the war to the work of what comes after the war, which is in some ways harder because it has no end that anyone can point to, no moment when it can be declared finished and set aside. I opened the window, moved the jasmine branch aside, let the full light in. Then I picked up the ledger and began. I want to tell you about the names, not the numbers. I've given you enough numbers. The numbers exist in the historical record, such as it is, imprecise, contested, the estimates varying depending on who is counting and what they are counting and what they have decided counts. Between 60 and 90% of the male population. A country of perhaps 500,000 reduced to perhaps 200,000, perhaps less. The men specifically, 9 in 10 some say. Others say less. No one says enough to make the number feel like anything other than an abstraction. So I want to tell you about the names instead. My father was Eusebio. He had been a farmer before the war, not a large farm, but sufficient. He had hands that were permanently stained at the knuckles from the soil, and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly, always slightly louder than you were prepared for. He was called up in the second year. He was 53 years old. The notice did not ask his age. My brother, Isidro, was 28 when the war began. He had a wife and 2 daughters in a village east of Asunción. He was a schoolteacher. Like Rosario, I have thought about that since, the particular cruelty of a country that consumed its schoolteachers. He left in the first column, the one with the flowers and the bands. He was at Chiuti. He was not among those who returned from Chiuti. Andres, you know. I have told you about his hands, about the river, about the letters that grew shorter and then stopped, about the transfer document I found in the afternoon in the field hospital, in a column I had not expected to find his name in. I have told you about the chair by the window, and the light through the jasmine, and the room that finally had space in it. You know what I have chosen to tell you. The rest belongs to me. Eduardo. My son was 19 when Asunción fell. The last letter I received from him was in the spring of 1868, brief, careful, written by a young man doing his best to be reassuring to his mother from a location he did not name. He said he was well. He said I should not worry. He said that things were difficult, but that he believed they would improve. I did not receive another letter. I searched the records when I returned to Asunción. The ones that still existed, the ones that had not been burned in August of 1868, when they were clearing the archives before the city fell. I found fragments, unit assignments, a movement record from late 1868, placing him in the northeast. Nothing after that. The records from the northeast in early 1869 were among the ones that had not survived, burned or lost, or simply never completed, because the people responsible for completing them had become part of what needed to be recorded. I kept searching for 2 years, methodically. The way I kept records, in order completely, without allowing the searching to become something other than searching. I found nothing that resolved the question. I found enough to understand that resolution was probably not something the question was going to offer. I have written his name in the ledger. In the margin section, with the others, the women of the road, Rosario, the boy of 10 with the callus. Eduardo Lucia's son. 19. Last known location, northeast, late 1868. The column for outcome, I left it with a line through it. Not blank. A line. The notation I had developed for records that could not be completed because the information did not exist to complete them. It meant, this is not an omission. This is the shape of what is missing. Those are my dead. But I want to tell you about the street. It was a morning in late April, perhaps 3 weeks after I had returned to Asunción. I had been working. There was reconstruction to participate in, records to rebuild from fragments, the particular work of a city trying to account for what it had been and what it now was. I stepped outside for a moment. The street in front of the house, the street I had walked since childhood, the one I had stood in when the column left in 1864, the one I had returned to in April. There were children playing. Several of them. 8, perhaps 10. Running, chasing, making the particular noise that children make when a game is going well and no one has yet been hurt, and the afternoon is still long enough that the end of it is not a concern. I stood in the doorway and watched them. And then I noticed something. I counted them the way I counted everything. Automatic. Without deciding to. 10 children on the street. 8 girls. 2 boys. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The children did not notice me. They were busy with the game. Whatever the game was, it had rules that mattered enormously to them and that I could not discern from the outside. They moved with the complete absorption of children for whom the present moment is the only moment that exists. I watched the 2 boys. They were perhaps 7 and 9. Running with the same absorption as the girls, no differently, no sense that they understood what their presence on that street represented, what the ratio of them to the girls around them meant in the arithmetic of what the war had done. They were simply children playing on a Tuesday afternoon in April. But I understood. This was what 9 in 10 looked like when it grew up. Not in the hospitals. Not in the ledgers. Not in the village with 63 people and 2 men. Here, in the ordinary morning of a street, in the simple count of children playing, in the ratio of girls to boys in a game whose rules I could not discern from a doorway. The war had been over for a year. Its arithmetic was just beginning. I went back inside. I opened the ledger to the margin section. Found the page with the names. Below Eduardo's name, below the line that meant this is the shape of what is missing, I wrote one more entry. Not a name. A number. And below the number, in the smallest writing I could manage while still being legible, because legibility mattered, because if it was worth writing, it was worth being able to read, I wrote, "This is what it looks like on a street." Then I closed the ledger. For the last time, I closed it. I did not plant the jasmine back within its borders. I thought about it. In the first weeks after I returned, when the house was being put back into a shape that could be lived in, I stood in the garden several times and considered it. The jasmine had taken the wall, the gutter edge, part of the window frame. It had done what it was always going to do if left alone long enough. It had expanded into the space available to it, indifferent to the borders that had been decided for it before the war. I left it. Not from sentiment. From something closer to recognition. The jasmine had survived by becoming something other than what it had been when I planted it. It seemed wrong to correct that now. The reconstruction of Asunción took years. Not the buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt in the time that buildings take. The other reconstruction. The one that does not have a name because it is not the kind of thing that gets named. The slow, daily work of a society, reconstituting itself from what remains of what it was, making decisions about structure and order and how to organize the living, when the living are so few and the shape of what was lost is still visible in every street, every family, every count of children playing in the afternoon. Paraguay had lost, by the most conservative estimates, half its population. By the less conservative ones, more. The men were the figure that history would reach for, because it was the most stark, the most legible, the one that required the least explanation to produce the appropriate response in whoever heard it. Between 60 and 90% of the male population, depending on the source, depending on the methodology, depending on what you counted and when you started counting, and whether you counted the ones who died in the camps as well as the ones who died in the battles. The number was never settled with precision. It could not be. The infrastructure for counting had been consumed by the thing being counted. The records, the military records, the civil records, the census data that had existed before the war. Those were among the things that had been burned in August of 1868, or lost in the retreat, or simply never completed, because the people responsible for completing them had become part of what needed to be recorded. I know this because I was one of the people responsible for the records. I know what survived. I know what didn't. I know the difference between a gap in the record and an absence of fact. They are not the same thing, though they look the same from the outside. A gap means the fact exists, but the record of it was lost. An absence means no one was there to record it, or the recording stopped before the fact completed itself, or the fact is still completing itself and has not yet arrived at the point where it can be written down. Eduardo is an absence, not a gap. I have made my peace with the distinction. The women rebuilt Paraguay. I do not say this as tribute. Tribute is for speeches, and I have no interest in speeches. I say it as record, as the notation of someone who was there, who kept the ledger, who watched it happen from the inside. The women who survived, and they survived in numbers that the war had not managed to reduce as severely, because the war had a preference for the men, had designed itself around the consumption of the men. Those women looked at what remained and began. Not because they had been asked. Not because there was a plan, an authority, a structure that had organized the beginning and assigned them their role in it. Because beginning was what was available. Because the alternative to beginning was not beginning, and not beginning was not something they were willing to do. Rosario rebuilt the school in her village. I know this because she wrote to me once, 2 years after we parted at the crossroads. A single page, careful and precise, in the handwriting of someone who had not lost the habit of precision. She said the school had 4 students, that she expected more in the spring, that her husband had not returned, which she wrote without elaboration, in the same sentence as the number of students, because that was the condition of things, and she had decided to keep it in proportion. She asked after me. I wrote back. We have written since, though less often than either of us intends. The letters are short. They contain more than they say. I have learned to read them the way I learned to read Andres' letters, for what surrounds the words, for the shape of what is present in the spaces between what is written. I still keep records. Not the military ledgers. Those belong to a different institution now, such as that institution is. My own. The kind I created in the margins when the official columns ran out of room. Names. What people carried. What they built. What happened to them. The record that no one asked me to keep, that I kept because it needed keeping, that I will keep until I cannot. I am sitting at the window as I tell you this. The same window. The same chair. The jasmine has grown further. It has taken most of the left side of the frame now, and in the spring it fills the room with a smell that I did not expect to still find bearable and do. The street outside is different from the street it was. More people than in the years just after the war. Children, more children than before, the mathematics of recovery working itself out in the only direction it can work. More girls than boys still. That will be true for a long time yet. The war ended in 1870. I am telling you this in 1887. 17 years. Paraguay has not recovered. I want to be precise about that. Not to diminish what has been built, because what has been built is real and was built by people who had no business being able to build it, given what they had to build it from. But recovered implies a return to what was, and what was is not what is coming. What is coming is something else. Something that has the shape of Paraguay without the same interior. A country that will carry the arithmetic of those years in its bones for generations, in ratios and absences, and the particular silences of families that are smaller than they should be. I do not think that is a tragedy. Or rather, it is a tragedy, but it is not only a tragedy. The people who rebuilt this country from what the war left did not do so tragically. They did so practically, stubbornly, with the aptitude for necessity that Rosario had named, and that I had seen in every woman, on every road, in every year of the war. They did it without being thanked, without being recorded in the columns that history reaches for first, without anyone declaring that what they were doing was remarkable. It was remarkable. I am recording it now, as I have always recorded it, in the margin, where the things that matter and have no official column go. I planted new jasmine last spring. Not to replace the old. The old is still there, still taking what space it finds available. Alongside it, in the part of the garden that had been left bare since before the war, a patch I had always intended to do something with and never had, because there was always something else that needed doing first. It has taken. It is small still. The kind of small that looks fragile but is not. The kind of small that is simply early. By next year, it will have reached the wall. By the year after, it will be somewhere I did not plan for it to be. I find I do not mind. The ledger is on the desk behind me. The current one. There have been several since the war, the margins filling, new pages beginning where the old ones ended. The names continue. What people carry. What they build. What happens to them. I do not know how many pages are left. I know there are pages left. That is enough. History told with space to breathe. If this story stayed with you, leave something in the comments. A word. A question. Where you are. The archive remembers what it receives.